Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled, The Airplane Knows Better Than the Pilot. Wrong. This was a flight of Lufthansa Airlines, flight number 2904, on September 15th, 1993, going from Frankfurt, Germany to Warsaw, Poland. Now, this is the Airbus aircraft involved in the accident, obviously operated by Lufthansa Airlines. It was an Airbus 320-200. And the accident report cites pilot error. And I take certain exception to that because I think the pilots were really handed a very poor bill of goods by the manufacturer. And there are certain issues that I have fought hard as chairman of the ALPA National New Aircraft Committee to reverse. And one of these has to do with thrust limitations on the thrust reversers. The manufacturers like to make it so the pilots can't hurt the engine. Okay, that makes sense. The reverse thrust at low speed and in certain high power conditions can damage the engine. But sometimes you need reverse thrust. I was landing a 727 in LaGuardia, and they had had an ice storm, and they nicely cleared all the runways, and the taxiways were reported as clear. What they didn't mention was the high speeds were covered in ice. So I land at LaGuardia, and I exit the high speed, and of course I'm going faster than normal taxi speed. That's what the high speed is for. And as I exit, getting ready to slow onto the taxiway, I realize that it is solid ice and I have absolutely no braking. So I come into full reverse on all three engines and I'm able to stop the aircraft. Now, some of the manufacturers like to limit that you can only get like 70%, which is a very low setting, and as the speed decreases, you get even less. And the interesting thing about it is a lot of the test pilots at the manufacturers are test pilots that I knew from working with out at Edwards. I got out of the Air Force and went to the airlines, and a lot of them got out and went to work for manufacturers. So I was often talking to people that I knew well that had flown in the Air Force, and it was a real pilot-to-pilot type of conversation. So it was very interesting in that respect. Now, if they could convey it to the manufacturer, that's another issue. But that's their job. Once I convince them the point that there are times when you do need more thrust than they're willing to give you. Now, this was an interesting situation, and they were told there was wind shear. Well, wind shear can be a very variable thing. We have certain parameters at my airline that if you have over certain conditions, you don't even land there. You go somewhere else. But wind shear can be less than that, and it can be any disturbance of the air swirling around, stuff like that. Well, they were told that they had a 20-knot crosswind. Well, it ended up being a 20-knot tailwind, supposedly, when they landed. And part of the issue in the accident report says, well, the tower didn't have adequate wind information. That's interesting because, they should be able to give you the wind information instantaneously. And, if you ever listen to air traffic control, or if you're a pilot, you often hear, if you've got wind conditions that the crew is concerned about, you'll hear them on short final. Just key the mic and say wind check, and the tower will announce what the current winds are at that moment because they can shift around. Well, I don't know why they didn't have current wind, but anyway, part of it was they had added 20 knots to the speed, which is what you do when you're flying with wind shear type of conditions. You typically can add 20 knots to the approach speed. Well, that's good, but you got a lot more energy you're carrying that you have to dissipate. And part of the problem, and they apparently did land in a crosswind because part of this whole issue is strut compression. Okay, so they're coming in to land, and they touch down approximately 20 knots hot at 170 knots, 200 miles per hour, and they end up touching down far beyond the normal touchdown point. They touch down at 770 meters, about 2,530 feet from the runway threshold. And you can see the runway markings there. The red indicates that the brakes were not active. The green indicates weight on wheels, and the blue indicates hydroplaning. Now, they touched down at high speed, 2,350 feet down the runway. And, once you got a main gear down, you should be able to get ground spoilers and reverse at least. You want to be a little careful on the brakes, and they got into a hydroplaning situation, which is the other problem is you got to have wheel spin up to get the brakes, and that's typically 72 knots. And they did not have that due to hydroplaning. So they essentially touched this aircraft down, and they had no way of stopping it, no way of getting ground spoilers to take lift off the wings, no way of getting reverse, and no way to get brakes. And only the left main gear touched down the runway, and they couldn't get the spoilers or the reverse system, obviously, to deploy. They had to have weight on both main gear. And in a crosswind, you got a lot of weight on one gear. I've touched down and had the other main gear in the air. But when you, in a situation like this, they had to have 6.3 tons on each main gear to get the spoilers and the wheel brakes, and that did not occur. They didn't get the second gear down till they were 5,000 feet down the runway. And so now they could start to get spoilers and reverse, but they couldn't get wheel brakes because they were hydroplaning and they didn't get wheel spin up. And roughly at about 72 knots, they saw that they were going to hit an obstacle off into the runway. They saw they weren't going to make the runway, so they steered to avoid the obstacle, and they hit an embankment. The training captain in the right seat was killed, and one of the occupants, who was overcome by smoke, was not able to escape. Now, as I mentioned, the computers on the aircraft didn't recognize it's on the ground. You know, pilots know when they're on the ground, and they should be able to activate systems such as ground spoilers and reverse, but the airplane kept them from doing this. A pilot knows when they're on the ground. In fact, I have certain instances where there was absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind that we had landed. You know, that's the fun of flying a 727. It makes you humble. And this is one of the issues I pressed. Now, these air-ground sensors can be interesting. I was doing a test flight on the 777, and we were looking at a maintenance issue. It was one of the squatch switches was inoperative, but we had the squatch switch on the other gear, and we had the radio altimeter to tell us we were on the ground. Well, they finally decided, normally they wouldn't fly with that, but we decided that the conditions were appropriate and we could go. The interesting thing, though, is we were doing touch and goes, and they got a new data point. Boeing got a new data point on this because we were doing touch and goes, and with the crosswind and lack of strut compression, the airplane needs 2 out of 3 to know it's on the ground, and we weren't getting all 3. And one was in op, so we needed both of the others. And one of the pilots was doing a touch and go. He was actually a retired pilot, and as he was slowing down, since the airplane thought it was still in the air, it kept trimming the horizontal stabilizer. So as we were slowing, it was trimming, and it trimmed down as we were slowing to about 50 knots, which was the lowest speed on the touch and go. So when we did the touch and go and took off, the aircraft was considerably out of trim, and that resulted in some very unusual pitch excursions on takeoff, let me put it that way. And I'm thinking, boy, this guy's only been retired 6 months and he's forgotten how to fly. Well, I get a call from the chief test pilot a couple days later and says, you know that little takeoff incident we had? And he goes, yeah. And he says, well, we went back and looked at the data and we found out what was going on. That wasn't his fault. The aircraft, as I mentioned there. But anyway, I pointed to many manufacturers that, be careful with these systems operations, that sometimes the airplane can be fooled and the pilots know it's on the ground, and to prevent them from getting ground spoilers and reverse and even brakes is bad. Of course, if you're hydroplaning, brakes aren't going to do you much good. You'll just blow the tires, get reverted rubber, and all sorts of nasty stuff. But anyway, you should at least be able to get the ground spoilers so the wing stops flying, and reverse. That is enough to get it slowed down. So, the airplane was destroyed. They blamed the pilots for this, which I think is a little overreaching, because I think the airplane certainly did not help them in this regard. So anyway, that's my take on the accident. I hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching.